Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're going to give it just a minute or two to let everybody filter in, then we'll introduce ourselves and get started. And as we're settling in, there's a poll on your screen asking if you visited Angel Island, Ellis Island, both. In my experience, I think for the first time ever, I'm seeing more people having visited Angel Island than Ellis Island. Oftentimes I enter rooms and at conferences and such, and I ask the question, I got more Ellis than Angel. So I'm feeling some pride right now. I'm gonna stop sharing that part of my screen. People will likely still filter in some more, but we're all here on time, so we can jump in and get started. I think I'm gonna leave that poll up for a little bit while we introduce ourselves. So I am Danielle Wetmore. I am the program manager at the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. And I am in conversation today with Stephen, who I'm going to let introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Lean. I'm the director of the American Family Immigration History Center, which is an on-site research center on Ellis Island. And it's also something that's online too. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here too in conversation. And this is the start of what we hope to be a long-lasting, ongoing series. So this is part one of Gateways and Dialogue, Navigating Immigrant Experiences on Angel and Ellis Islands. We hope for this to serve as an introduction to our spaces, to comparing and contrasting them. And as we move forward, we'll dig deeper and deeper into different topics and questions. Today, we're going to start off with Stephen and myself giving overviews of the process through Ellis and Angel Island. If you have clarification questions or questions throughout, you can stick them in the chat. We have Gabe here monitoring the chat, tracking your questions, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Just in interest of time, I would really appreciate it if we use the chat for questions. If you stayed muted, you joined muted and your camera is off, you're welcome to turn your camera on if you like, and we can all see each other and be in community in that way, but there's no pressure to. It looks like 73% of the people here have participated in our poll, and Angel Island is still winning. 86% of us have been to Angel Island, and 50% of us have been to Ellis Island. I have the privilege of having been to both. I think I'm going to end this poll, and then Stephen, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Sharing my screen. And okay, everybody can see the title screen there. Okay, good
Yep.
deal. So welcome to Gateways and Dialogue. Danielle and I are going to be navigating the immigrant experiences, plural, on Angel and Ellis Islands. And thank you all for joining. I am an employee of the Statue of Liberty-Ellis Island Foundation. That's the foundation that runs the History Center. Our history goes back to 1982 when Lee Iacocca and Ronald Reagan led the effort to raise funds for the historic restoration of Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. That culminated in Liberty Weekend in 1986, celebrating the Statue of Liberty's 100th birthday. Shortly thereafter, we did help open the Ellis Island Museum of Immigration in 1990. You can see a before and after pic there. Part of what we do as people who are dedicated to restoring and preserving these sites is also preserving and celebrating the stories of the people who experienced them while they were still in action, so to speak, while immigration was taking place, the inspection was taking place at Ellis Island. And that's what the History Center is all about. 363 days a year we're open. Of course, every day of the year you can log into our website and do the same kind of searching there. So a couple of things that people don't know about the history of Ellis Island itself is that the building that I work in every day, the building that Danielle visited and that people would visit today, is not the original Ellis Island Immigration Station. The original immigration station was opened in January of 1892. It was made entirely out of wood. You can see it on the left-hand side of the screen here. Since it was made out of wood, during the summer of 1897, it burned to the ground and took a lot of records with it. We still have customs records for those days, and those are the records that you're going to see if you're searching online or in person here. But the building that exists now actually opened in December of 1900. And you'll notice there's a gap between when one building ceased to exist and the other building opened. During that 2.5 year period, people were processed at the barge office, which was probably just as much fun as it sounds. Those records tend to be a little bit spotty if you're looking for people who showed up in the 98, 99 era. And I think it's just because the nature of the facility itself being temporary, being something that they were just kind of using on the fly, didn't lend itself to as accurate record keeping as we would hope for. But the building that we have now was in operation until 1954. So our records actually go back a little bit further before Ellis Island and go all the way up into the 1950s. So if you're looking for somebody who came over on the East Coast, maybe through the Port of New York, give it a shot. Brief overview of Ellis Island. About 12 million immigrants were processed here. On a busy day, you could see upwards of 5,800 people being processed. About 10 steamships per day would enter New York Harbor. And then the steerage class folks would be put on a ferry and they would be shuttled back across the harbor into the ferry slip, the same ferry slip people arrive on today. And then they would be processed here in the facility. About 20% of those people were detained, about half for legal reasons, about half for health reasons, and ultimately only 2% of people were deported. If you were deported, it was the shipping company who paid for your room and board while you were here, and also they paid for your voyage back. So when we look back at Ellis Island, it looks tremendously successful. Like, what was the big deal? What was everybody so worried about? Only 2% of people were being sent back. Well, Ellis Island during peak immigration years, when we're talking about 1892 until the early 1920s, looked very different from what it looks like today. In fact, it was already in a process of evolution as immigration laws changed. Big immigration laws passed in 1903 and 1907, requiring more information to be collected from these immigrants. It changed what a manifest looked like. It added layers to the inspection process, and it changed the physical topography of the islands. When you start putting more emphasis on things like how much money someone had, what was their physical health, who were they going to see, you need to expand your inspection facilities. Hospitals were built, dormitories were built, all to meet these changing legislative and cultural needs. Only steerage class passengers are processed on Ellis Island. So when you talk about Ellis Island, you're really talking about the people's history. During this time, even those 20% of people who were detained were only kept maybe a few days, usually in the single digits. So detention times were relatively short. However, when you arrived on Ellis Island, you were in the ferry slip, the same ferry slip you'd be on today. You would be taking your baggage into the main building. You would enter the same front door that most people enter today. And your first destination would be the registry room. This picture makes it look very spacious, very calm. It's a little bit deceiving because on your way to the registry room, you would enter what was called the line, as in an assembly line. Except this line was a series of medical inspectors who would give you very brief, very intensive inspections. You can see here one of the first things they did was check someone's eye. And if you're talking about processing 5,800 people a day, you're talking 11,000, 12,000 eyeballs that these people are touching every day. You can imagine how pleasant.
You are muted, Stephen, for some reason.
I'm sorry, I don't think I touched anything. How far did I get there? You're muted, Danielle. Sorry.
11,000 eyeballs.
11,000 eyeballs a day. So we didn't miss a whole lot. You can imagine how pleasant that was. So when you were being inspected, you'll notice there's a lot of caging, a lot of fences to sort of direct you in a specific way and to segregate you. If something was found wrong, you would be marked with chalk on your clothing and you would be sent to another room for further inspection. They would test your mental and physical health. You can see an eye chart with the Hebrew alphabet on one of these pictures. So they would inspect you further. That was something that nobody wanted. Nobody wanted that extra attention there. But if you were making it through either that kind of brief physical exam or the further inspection, you were going to be in a registry room that looked more like this. It was crowded, especially during those months of spring and summer when the weather was nice. 5,000, 5,800 people a day, a very sort of DMV kind of experience, a long line at an amusement park with nothing that fun at the end of the line. This is the experience of people in the registry room, as opposed to today where we encourage people to wander around. We keep it very open, very bright. You would be segregated depending on the ship you came in, on the manifest you would be recorded on, and you would get up to this desk where an inspector would have the manifest that traveled with you, and he would make sure that what he saw in front of him matched what he saw on the paper. And if there was any problem during medical inspection, during this paperwork inspection, you would get to spend time in the dorms. And you would be detained. You would have an open air place. This picture on the right shows an open air place with fencing. Always remember there was fencing, there was segregation going on. This was on the roof of the main building, but those dormitory beds look pretty close together. I don't see much in the way of mattresses or pillows or anything that would lend you warmth and comfort, especially during those very chilly New York winter months. But if that didn't happen to you or your stay was brief, you would be allowed to descend the stairs of separation into the area that the History Center is located in today. It's called the Kissing Post. Kissing Gates of America is the title of this photo, showing two women who are very happy to see each other indeed. But also note the prominence of the fencing on the left-hand side of this photo. So even in moments of joy, you were always aware that you were in a facility that was processing people, that was a machinery designed to process people through and to shuttle them into the different categories in which they deemed you to belong. While you're staying there, maybe a few hours, maybe a few days, you will probably want to leave your mark with a very New York, New Jersey kind of thing. The graffiti walls. These graffiti examples are found outside of our library. You can see one of them seems to be depicting an inspector with a hat on and a uniform. There's a dog in the corner. There are people writing notes, listing their names, listing their dates. So that was something that people who are maybe bored, maybe angry, have a lot of energy and no place to go. This is an outlet for their expression. One of our earliest immigrants that we really like to celebrate is Israel Balin, who became Irving Berlin. He arrived as a young boy in 1893. That manifest is kind of spare in terms of the information that it's collecting. We get a little bit later, we see manifests that are a little bit more well-formed. Anybody who collected comic books like I did probably saw in the back these kind of cheesy advertisements for Charles Atlas and his exercise regime, trying to encourage us all to be the biggest, manliest men that we could. Charles Atlas was actually born Angelo Siciliano. And so that's the name that's recorded on the manifest when he arrived as an 11-year-old boy in 1904. A little bit later, manifests are going to have 2 pages worth of questions as immigration laws dictated that. Michio Ito was from Japan. Unlike most people from Japan, he arrived in New York because he was coming from the United Kingdom. He lived in California. Ultimately, he was deported during World War II. I like to show his manifest because it reflects the diversity of Ellis Island, and also the fact that just because you made it through, it doesn't mean you had a happy ending. Not everybody who came over ultimately lived, quote, the American dream. And this is what one of those 2-page manifests look like. You can see just how complex it is, how much information they're collecting, which is really great for us because we're nosy and we're trying to find people's immigration stories, not so much for the people who experienced it. And a note about measuring detention times. Remember, it's the shipping company that paid for your upkeep, that paid for your trip back. So when we see a detention page on a manifest, and you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, there's an arrow pointing down to a column on a special inquiry form. That's listing how many meals people had at Ellis Island. The 3 gentlemen in this photo were all deported. The young man on the right was named Giuseppe Iacovino. He had 8 breakfasts, 8 suppers, and 8 dinners on Ellis Island. So instead of saying he spent 8 days on Ellis Island, they're measuring the meals that he had because that's what the shipping company was on the hook to pay for, which I think is kind of interesting. In our database, of course, we do have a lot of diversity, but the largest groups represented really are not that surprising. Italians, people of Jewish ancestry, Germans, and Poles. Also, some of the smaller ethnic groups, we always like to celebrate them as well, because although the numbers might be small, their impact on our culture in New York and across the US still felt. Some of this had to do with geography. Some of this also had to do with specific legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917 that prohibited people from certain parts of the globe from coming over. So if you want to look at the history of Ellis Island and you want to know why some numbers for different ethnic groups are larger than others, you're really dealing with legislative and social history as well. After peak years, because of nationality-based quotas that were introduced in 1921 and tightened in 1924, that introduced also the modern passport and visa system. So Ellis Island as a place of inspection ceased to be. It became a place of detention. If you're one of those folks who had a health issue or a paperwork issue, you would be the residents. You would be the guests of Ellis Island. And detention times were longer because to determine someone's loyalty to the United States, especially as we enter the Cold War proper, it takes a little bit longer than to determine whether or not someone is going to recuperate quickly enough from something like scarlet fever or polio or tuberculosis. So the nature of Ellis Island and the experience changed dramatically. Manifests from this time reflect those changes. On Claude McKay's manifest, the Harlem Renaissance writer Claude McKay, he had visited New York before, that this is his final trip that he used to become a naturalized citizen. And you can see on column 12 of his manifest to the right, they're noting that he had a passport, that he had a visa or a reentry permit. That's something we don't see on pre-World War I manifests. The same is true for Enrico Fermi's manifest. He came over in 1938 because he was married to a woman who was Jewish. And at that time in Italy, the Jewish community was facing terrible persecution. Also, Mama Celeste, Celeste Lizio, who started the famous Mama Celeste frozen pizza brand, came over in the 1930s. And we have her manifest in our records too. You get a little bit more current into the 50s. Manifests are going to start only having passenger names and those passport, visa, reentry permit numbers. The nuclear physicist Chien-Shiung Wu, who is the godmother of nuclear physics, helped with the Manhattan Project. She is arriving back in New York to her apartment on Claremont Avenue. You can see we have her name, the misspelling her name, and that she is somebody who was born in China, but not a lot of other info about her. It's even more true of D.T. Suzuki, whose manifest we see at the bottom of this slide, who was a visiting scholar at Columbia University. We're literally getting only his name and visa number. And that can make finding records really tricky if your name is a common name that you're looking for. After 1954, when the last detainee on Ellis Island left, Ellis Island was pretty much abandoned. In 1965, two really important things happened in our history. Lyndon Johnson made Ellis Island part of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. And that same year, he passed the Hart-Celler Act, which eliminated nationality-based quotas from the immigration process. And it made things like what we call chain migration, occupation-based migration, really the new standard. And that brings us back to 1982, when Ronald Reagan announced a plan to restore the statue and Ellis Island to their past glory, and brings us back to where I started with where my foundation kicks in and the stories that we're trying to tell and why we think they're important. So thank you all for listening. I'll turn this back over to Danielle.
Thank you, Stephen. And we have in the chat a connection already being made that Chien-Shiung Wu also came through Angel Island. So thinking about these ways in which our spaces really are in conversation with each other and are physically experienced by folks. If you could stop sharing your screen.
Sure.
Fantastic. And I know that I'm sure that there are questions out there for Stephen. I'm going to jump into the Angel Island side of things, and then again, we'll have a Q&A at the end too. And so Stephen brought up a lot of really interesting things for us to consider. And from the very beginning of the history of Angel Island, it has been compared to Ellis Island. There's a 1907 article I'm from the San Francisco Examiner that I'm going to come back to throughout my presentation. And it was calling Angel Island the Ellis Island of the West. And I wanted to start too with a little bit of history of my organization, the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We just celebrated our 40th year. And our mission statement says, for all immigrants, descendants, and families, Angel Island is a living landmark that symbolizes diverse experiences of detention, racism, exclusion, hope, and determination. The foundation protects the historic site, elevates its stories, promotes learning, and celebrates the new beginnings and immigrant contributions that define the strength of the U.S. We inspire a more equitable, inclusive future, one that embodies how immigrants make nations better. I also know that we have, as part of our viewership tonight, we have people who have personal ties to Angel Island, and I'm sure also Ellis Island, and their families experienced this. Ooh, why isn't my cursor working? There we go. And so we were in New York, right? We've moved to the other coast. This little red star here is showing that we're in the California Bay Area. And this island here is Angel Island. It's the biggest island in the bay. And to think about those numbers, right? Stephen was able to present some numbers. Our numbers are a little bit different. Our numbers are a little bit smaller. Part of that is because we are primarily a detention facility throughout the entirety of our history, right? Ellis Island transitions into being primarily a detention facility, but starts as inspection. Inspection also happens on Angel Island, but the vast majority of people processed through the port of San Francisco, so we can see 1 million people processed through the port, that's being processed on the boat. And this number also includes, well, a lot of different things. But people who are coming through Angel Island came from at least 80 different countries. The amount of people who were detained was about 70% of all arrivals. And so again, it's primarily a detention facility. And if we're looking at length of stay, about 60% of the individuals who came through stayed for 3 days, right? The bulk of people who came through Ellis Island stayed for 3 to 5 hours. So we're looking at hours versus days. And that population looks a little bit different too, right? So Chinese immigrants represented 1/3 of all detained individuals. And then the next is the next largest by number. So after Chinese, we have Japanese, South Asian, Russian and Jewish, Korean, Filipino, and Mexican. And of course, other countries as well following. And so thinking about the population, it's a little bit different. Thinking about the purpose is a little bit different. And a lot of that has to do with the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, right? That says Chinese immigrants are fundamentally unwelcome to enter the United States. And this law necessitates places like Angel Island and Ellis Island because before this, other than the Page Act in 1875, we can also think about the Page Act, there wasn't an idea of the federal government limiting who could and could not come into the country. That was being limited, absolutely, but by cost. It's very expensive to move from one country to another country. So the poorest of the poor have never had access to move from one country to another country. And the shipping companies also got to make a lot of choices about who they would and would not let on their boats. In 1875, though, the federal government says we're stepping in, we're adding a filter. So this is the first time there's paperwork that says some people can come and some people cannot come. So it's not until 1875 that we get these ideas of who can and can't come, which then requires a need for paperwork, which requires a need for inspections and thinking about it and checking in. And so we open, the Angel Island Immigration Station in 1910. So after Ellis Island gets it started, and there's a lot of things that happen similarly. Inspections happen on the boat before you enter the islands or the spaces. If you are in first class, you're most likely not getting off the boat and going to Angel Island. You're being processed on the boat and going directly to San Francisco. Steerage, passengers are absolutely most likely getting off the boat. Second class passengers, it depends on a variety of factors. Your race and ethnicity is part of that. The experience on Angel Island is one of discrimination and segregation, absolutely. And so after you have your preliminary inspection on the boat, you get on a smaller ferry. That ferry takes you to Angel Island. So unlike Ellis Island, when you visit Angel Island today, this is not where you get off the ferry. This does not exist anymore. We'd love it to, but it's very expensive. But you can donate money to us. We'd love to have it to raise money for a new pier. But as you get off the boat, your luggage goes into the luggage shed over on the side of the screen there. And the building that these folks are looking at is this building here. This is the administration building. It is no longer there. Stephen and I were talking last week and he said, well, we got our fire out early. We did it at the end, right? We had our fire in 1940, which is part of the reasons our records look so different. And so that administration building isn't there anymore, but that's what people are looking at as they're getting off the boat, and that's where they're going. And they're being separated. They're being separated by race, they're being separated by sex, and they're being separated by age in some cases. Mostly that's in the case of boys, whether they're allowed to stay with mom or go with the men. If dad's around, go with him or be on his own with the men. And that happens at the age of 13. And so this building doesn't exist anymore. You can't go into it, but we can recreate going through it with the help of archival images. And so we also have a registry room. Our registry room also is separated with bars and benches, and it's highlighted here. So as we go through this map, the pictures are showing what's highlighted in the map on the left. And we have this 1907 article to go back to think about how folks were imagining immigrants would be processing through here. So the quote about this room is, immigrants are first received and taken to an examination room, divided into compartments separated by iron railings. The Chinese and Japanese are separated from the European, and the women of the latter class are also received in a separate compartment. So again, men and women separated, classes separated, and immigrant group separated. The back part of this picture, we can see this skylight here, and it's illuminating this space that's highlighted in blue. And here the article from 1907 states, here under a skylight, the first test for trachoma is made, and if suspicions are aroused which find further examination necessary, they are assessed to the physician's quarters, where from the waiting room, they pass to a private examination room. Okay, so Stephen was telling us that they did eyeball checks, right? He gave us this great number of 11,000 eyeballs. This is also an eyeball check. This article, though, said that trachoma was, quote, a notoriously Asiatic disease. Okay, see, Stephen just made a face because they're checking for trachoma at Ellis Island too. So we can see how ideas of disease are also used to other groups in ways that they aren't necessarily different. Trachoma was a problem for everybody. It's a highly contagious eye disease that is passed on contact. But is important to think about when thinking about Angel Island, that already before it's open, people are saying this is a way of keeping disease out. This is a way of keeping people out who have these diseases and are inherently harmful. And so as you move through, right, so main examination room to the lab space, then you're in these corral spaces. Again, they are separated out with fences and benches. And so if the applicant passes the first test, so that's the cursory medical examination that's happening in this blue area. So if you don't pass that, you'll head to the hospital, another building, or you might be sent back immediately. But if you pass this section, if the applicant passes the first test, he goes into another room, divided in compartments according to his manifest, which gives his mental, moral, and financial qualifications. And this is tied to the law, right? The people are saying immigrants have to be fit for public, they can't become a public charge. And so the ideas of what makes somebody mentally, morally, and financially fit is also subjective. Yes, part of the law has ties to it to say what that means, but in other cases, the immigration officials have a lot of leeway of determining what this means for them. Also, immigration officials at Angel Island are told to assume that Asian immigrants are deportable, that they're coming here and we will deport them. We're not assuming that we're letting them in. The first assumption is that they are going to be deported. We just have to find out why. So this is another overview of that administration building over a bird's eye picture of what is there right now. So we just went through this journey, right? They got off the boat into the front porch, main examination hall, to the physician's lab, to the compartments here. Now, if you are healthy, you are deemed to be morally, financially, and mentally fit, then you can head over to the baggage room, collect your stuff, go back down to the ferry, and head to San Francisco. Again, the majority of people who come through Angel Island, that's not them, right? 70% of people are not then getting off this same day. And so that means your next step in many cases is to head into the detention facilities. If you are a woman or child, if you're a woman or a child, your house on the second floor of the administration building, really sort of the second floor of this section in the middle here. Men are housed in the detention building that's up over this way. So they are connected, the administration building and the detention barracks, by a covered stairway, hallway combo. And so you will go then from this space here in the registry room to the enclosed porch and up the stairs into the barracks, which is, here's another view of it, that covered stair hall. We rebuilt it, recreated it in 2009. So if not passed, he is transferred, if Asiatic, to the Oriental quarters, some distance away, until his case has been decided. This is a picture of those barracks. And so if we look just at this middle section here, this is 6 beds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that just keeps going. This space is also separated by race. So there's the Chinese section of the barracks. There's the other Asian part of the barracks. European men are often housed in the administration building. Sometimes here it gets, depending on the exact year, these things also change. So in many ways, this is sort of an overview of standards, right? Initially, when the building first opened in 1910, the bunks in the Chinese dorm did not have mattresses. There was a racist idea that Chinese men did not need mattresses. They then learned that everybody else got mattresses, and they fought to get mattresses and eventually got mattresses. But the way that you were treated is very much dependent on your race, class, and gender. That we come back to that over and over again. And that transfers into mealtime as well. The quality of your food and the amount of money spent on your meal is different. So European folks on the island, the most money was spent on their meals. Chinese men, the least money was spent on their meals. They did fight for better, and they got that too. And so we can get into that at some other point. But there are many moments of people standing up and saying how we're treated on Angel Island. Is it fair? Is it safe? And are able to push for something different. But that the Chinese-Japanese dining room is right over here. So people are going back up and down those stairs to be connected here. Standard or average length of stay is about 3 days, right? But I mean, maybe you all are better at math than I am. But if we think about averages, it means they're taking that number of people who actually don't ever spend a night on Angel Island. So that's 0, which somehow gets weighted a ton in math. With the people who are here, our longest detained person was Kwok Shi, and she was detained for 22 months. And so 3 days is this numeric average, but really if you're either here for like a day or 2, or you're here for a few weeks is really how it is. And so your life starts to revolve around these few spaces. You have your bunk, where you don't have all of your belongings with you. You have some belongings with you, right? The dining room, which you have access to when you're brought there and brought back. It's not free access. There is also a recreation area. This is the Chinese men's recreation area, because again, that was also a segregated experience. And going to boards of special inquiry and having further conversations and interrogations about whether or not you should be let into the United States. And you can go through this over and over again. One of the reasons the Chinese population stays on the island for so long is because they are able to appeal decisions. They have access to the legal structure, largely because Chinese folks have been in California since the gold rush. And so San Francisco Chinatown has a robust community of people who can bind together to help each other. One of the things that people really complained about in being detained was their poor treatment, absolutely, but was also how bored they were. And we have in the detention barracks, people carved into the walls. There are over 200 poems carved into the walls. And so often, I've worked in historic buildings for a while, and so often people say, oh, if only these walls could talk. Ours do. Ours literally hold the voices and feelings and emotions and sentiments of the people who were detained here. They weren't allowed to be carving into the wall. It was seen as graffiti. But this is just one poem, and I'm going to read it. Imprisoned in this wooden building, I am always sad and bored. I remember since I left my native village, it has been several full moons. The family at home is leaning on the door, urgently looking for letters. Whom can I count on to tell them I am well? Prisoners in this wooden building constantly suffer sadness and boredom. I remember the hardships I had to endure when I was coming here. I cannot prophesy which day I will cross the barrier. The years and months are easily spent in vain. So here we can feel the boredom, the frustration, and not knowing how long you're going to be there, trying to forecast, will you be let in? And the reality is that either you're deported or you're let in. Many of the Chinese immigrants are let in. They are able to appeal and get to a place where they are able to come in. And this is a Chinese family having their paperwork signed in order to be let into the United States. So they will get onto a ferry and come into the country. Guangxi, who was here for 22 months, she was eventually able to come in as well. So she spent all of this time. The immigration services spent all of these resources of housing her and interrogating her to let her in. And so then you get on this last ferry boat ride, hopefully, and you're in San Francisco and you can go from there. Maybe you stay in Chinatown. Maybe you go other places. We have records of people coming from Eastern Europe in through Angel Island to get on a train to go to New York City, right? People are creating communities all over the United States that without Angel Island and Ellis Island, without these laws, these restrictions, or these people coming in, our communities, all of us, no matter where we are in the country, look very, very different. And so we can think about how this experience touches our lives, even if we don't personally know someone who came in through Angel or Ellis Island. I'm going to go back to this picture here. Because this is an early picture of the site, right? In 1940, the administration building burns down. That's really the end of people being detained on Angel Island. It's not the end of immigration detention, absolutely, because that continues all the way into today. California State Parks originally wanted to tear down the detention barracks museum, or what was then just the detention barracks. And a group of people heard about this and fought for keeping it, saying that this is our story, this is our history. It was largely a group of people whose families had gone through Angel Island and been detained here, and they said, this is our story. You can't burn it down and erase our stories. And so there are stories of people fighting for their rights inside of this building, and there are people fighting for this to be remembered, for us to learn from it all the way into today. Well, that was probably dizzying. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We have just over 15 minutes for some Q&A. And so you can go ahead and make sure that you're sticking your questions in the chat. Gabe will get them to us.
Let's see, does this work?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome, great. Let's see, Tom has a question about language barriers. So I know, at least for Angel Island, that they had employed some interpreters, but Stephen, I wanted to learn the Ellis Island experience. Like, is that the same?
Yeah, at Ellis Island, there were interpreters present at different stages of the process, especially in the registry room. The former mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, was actually an interpreter at Ellis Island before he became mayor, obviously. there were not interpreters present at every stage, but during the registry room process of paperwork, matching you up with the manifest, there were interpreters present. I'm not always certain how many languages are represented on any given day, or if only on certain days, maybe certain languages would be spoken. I know that being married to an immigrant myself and having gone through the green card and citizenship process in present day, when you show up for your green card interview, after we got married, we were told that because we were both fluent in English, my husband is Italian. Italian is a common enough language. We didn't have to come on a specific day. But at the specific office that we went to, they only had a Japanese interpreter certain days of the week. And there were people that were having to reschedule their interview because they will not interview you unless they feel that you are understanding it fluidly and fluently. And that was the case on Ellis Island as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that for Angel Island that absolutely we did have interpreters. And depending on the language you were interpreting and your background, these interpreters were given different levels of trust by immigration services. And so eventually they did have to hire Chinese interpreters who were Chinese, but they were seen as sort of dangerous, that they might lie or they might help that immigrant come through and answer questions in the way that would allow them in falsely. And so you wouldn't stick with the same interpreter for the entirety of your Board of Special Inquiry or your interrogation that was happening, that they would trade out who was there to make sure that people weren't colluding.
Danielle, I think speaking of famous interpreters, I'm remembering, I can't remember his name, but there was a Chinese interpreter on Angel Island who had a blended heritage. I believe on his mother's side, he was of Chinese descent, but on his father's side, he was of white European Caucasian descent. And it's really interesting. I wish I could remember his name. I'm really sorry, everybody. But it's really interesting how people who also would have found themselves in sort of in between identities in society, how they were employed literally and figuratively to fill these niches where these cultures and where these languages overlapped.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Let's see. So Judy wants to know if you think that there are any lessons that we can take away from these two different gateways. Maybe thinking about history in like a modern lens.
I think I can start with that one. There are lots of things I think about. One of the things that I think about a lot is about a year and a half ago now, I had the privilege of giving a tour of the Angel Island Immigration Station to recently incarcerated folks who were detained at the border, the Mexican border. And through the experience, they were willing to share their connections between Angel Island and their experiences on the southern border. And it struck me how often they were saying, this is so similar to the experience that we just had a number of months ago, or in some cases, a couple of years ago, but really in recent history. And the thing that I keep coming back to every time I'm there and every time I think about this work is, I didn't ask them this question, but they sort of on their own brought up that if they had to choose where they were going to be detained and the quality of life they would have, they would choose Angel Island. And so I think for me, what is an important lesson is that so often we think of history as something we have progressed from. But this isn't one we've progressed from. This is one that we move, but continue to be in relationship with.
Yeah. Like Danielle said, there's a lot of lessons that I take with me to work and that I take home at night. One thing that always strikes me, regardless of which of the phases of Ellis Island history we're talking about, is that when it comes to immigration policy or foreign policy or really any policy, the MO tends to be giving with one hand and taking with the other. There's always some kind of strange trade happening. Like after the Displaced Persons Acts of 1948 and 1950 were passed, hot on the heels of that, we placed the Internal Security Act into play, which made communists register, among other things. And so a lot of the refugees at that point, after World War II, were coming from places that had fallen or were going to fall behind the Iron Curtain. And so it's really strange that we are opening the door a little bit at that point. But then at the same time, we don't want the quote wrong kind of people. And we hear this all, they might be a sleeper cell. We hear this in so many refugee situations today, whether it's Syria or anywhere else. We want to have this impulse to reach out and to be generous and kind, but at the same time, this streak of fearfulness is also present. Also, there's an adage about if you build a 10-foot fence, someone will invent an 11-foot ladder. So every time that immigration law changes, there are unintended consequences for better and for worse for people who are trying to come. The Asiatic Bar Zone Act of 1917 also introduced a literacy test because people in power thought that that would weed out a lot of immigrants. It did not. It turns out that the people who had the drive to come to the US, who could afford to, they were a little bit more literate and smarter than people in the halls of Congress thought they would be. When the Johnson-Reed Act, the National Quotas Act, was passed in 1924, it really cut down on the number of immigrants coming from lots of places. It favored Northern Europeans and Western Europeans. But between 1924 and 1944, the Johnson-Reed Act allowed 250,000 Caribbean immigrants to enter the United States. Why? Because they were living in Dutch colonies, in French colonies, in British colonies in the Caribbean, and they were coming into this country using those very, very high quotas for those Western European countries. As a result, we benefit with things like the Harlem Renaissance, and that was definitely not the intention of either Johnson or Reed who passed that act. So every time that you try to categorize people, you make more rules, you are inevitably creating more exceptions to those rules. It's like a big game of whack-a-mole sometimes, it seems. So the more red tape there is, in a strange way, the more opportunities can come out of that. Never expect there to be no consequences for a change in policy.
And I think I would just add to that, that this, something that is also a lesson, is that there's always been an idea of who is a good immigrant and who is a bad immigrant. It's just who gets chosen in the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant category shifts and changes depending on the moment, depending on the geopolitical atmosphere, depending on all kinds of different things. But we have, from the very beginning of our history, had this idea of there are some people who are worthy and there are some people who are not worthy.
And I think it would be really interesting if people in this group and elsewhere would like to discuss it in another session, how that's tied to what it means to be an American, how that's reflected in like the name changes, how that's reflected in the identities that people adopt and who was let in. Danielle mentioned moral, mental, and financial fitness. But still today, we seem to equate these things, don't we? When we talk about self-care and fitness, if we're not careful, we can start making moral judgments, and we can start judging people who are maybe not neurotypical. We can judge people who did not have the financial opportunities that some of us did, and viewing that through a lens of a certain kind of privilege, things can get equated and conflated that really have nothing to do with each other. The moral health of someone, you're telling me you can judge the moral health of someone by a few minutes of a series of doctors looking at your eye and seeing how you breathe and asking you a few intrusive questions. It seems really far-fetched to us now. So yeah, I would really like to discuss that further with all of you guys, because I think all these things, this notion of identity, if are you an American? Are you an Italian American? Are you an Italian who is living in America?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes left, so we're going to keep answering questions as they're in. We might not get to everybody's, but that's the great thing about this series, is that this is going to be a continuing conversation. So even if you have a question that's too big for us to answer in the next 5 minutes, we'll hold it and consider it for future episodes.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Open to the
Okay.
inspiration.
So good thing that I think we have some quick ones. So Patrick, these are both for you, Stephen. So Patrick wants to know, why is there a difference between Southern and Northern Italians? And Eliz and Joe wanted to know how many Asians by nationality entered the US through Ellis Island. If you can.
Sure. Well, the Italian question, between Northern and Southern, really it's a matter of economics. Still today, there is a political and an economic divide between Northern and Southern Italy. Northern Italy, especially during Ellis Island's day, it was much more industrially developed. In the southern part of Italy, this was more an agricultural economy. A lot of the folks that are coming over from that region, they're coming from Naples, they're coming from Palermo through these ports, and their occupation is going to be listed as farmer, peasant, which is a really antiquated kind of term for us. But back then, that really would have described what they were, people who were living off the land agriculturally. The number of Asians by nationality, I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that those numbers are really, really small. There were only about 1,200 people who were listed as Pacific Islanders. We have very, very few Koreans, Japanese, Chinese. I don't have the exact numbers as they were recorded just at the tip of my tongue right now. But a lot of what we run into, not just with people from Asia, but it does, get worse the further we get from the Western Hemisphere, is that people are mislabeled. People who wouldn't have necessarily identified as one thing are labeled as that because in the eyes of the purser and his crew, they weren't making distinctions. The level of conscientiousness about identity just wasn't there. So a lot of times the numbers that we do have, I believe the number of people who were listed as Chinese from 1899 to 1931 was between 60 and 65,000. So 2,000 or 3,000 a year coming through Ellis Island. But would all of those people have readily identified primarily as Chinese? We don't know with a lot of folks. A lot of those that are in our system who are listed as Chinese are coming over not as immigrants, but their records exist on crew lists. So if you're a member of a crew, your arrival in the US is going to be noted on a manifest just like everyone else. And that's a real challenge. That's a great question. And I would love to be able to talk about it further. But the exact numbers are really hard to come by. I think, Danielle, the numbers for Angel Island, because of the fire and for other reasons, they can get a little blurry and sketchy too in general. And this is probably something that's not just a coincidence, but more systemic too.
Yeah, I think we could have a great conversation on records and where they are and why they're hard and what we can learn and what we can't learn from our records at our sites and how do you read between the lines. I also see this great question that came in from Joyce about wanting to know about Angel Island and Ellis Island in the American psyche. And so maybe an exploration of Ellis versus Angel in popular culture, which I think would be so interesting. But we are basically out of time. Gabe has put in the chat a survey that we would love it if you could click on that and fill it out. It helps us just see who's coming, what kind of programming we're doing. You can put in there future ideas for this specific series as well. And we'll also email you the link to the survey, but I find that it's nice to have a captive audience for surveys. And if you fill it out, you might win a gift card. But I want to thank everybody for coming. This will be shared on YouTube. So if you know anybody who didn't get to catch this that you think would be interested, you can send them to our YouTube channel. It should be there in just a little bit. But thank you, Stephen, for being in conversation with me too.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everybody.
All right. I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. I am going to end this Zoom. Bye, everybody.